It seems many sewists really fear stretch material. Why? Don't do that. As I have been learning to sew and sewing my own wardrobe over the past almost 3 years now, I have heavily gravitated toward knit fabric, stretch fabric. A lot of that comes down to texture and just like the overall comfort for me. I like the way that it feels on my body. But also, stretch material brings a certain level of adjustability to a garment, which I really appreciate. And it allows me to be very, very chill when I am winging it on a garment design, which I also super appreciate. So while I don't consider myself an expert at sewing knit, or really an expert at sewing anything, a lot of you have started asking questions, asking for tips and tricks and advice, especially since I don't own or use a serger. And I thought, hey, maybe my way of doing things, whether correct or not, probably not, might be of some help to people who would like to start sewing with stretch material and are a little intimidated by the stereotypical stretch material problems. First bit of advice before anything else, ignore the stereotypes. I think the reason that I just dove into sewing knit and wasn't afraid of it was because I didn't know the stereotypes. Ignorance truly is bliss. But before we get really into it, let's talk about someone else who's always winging it and making it work with a bit higher stakes. June. This video is sponsored by June's Journey, a hidden object game that follows our gutsy protagonist June as she tries to solve the mystery of her sister's murder in the roaring, glitzy, sometimes seedy 1920s. June is always traveling to new places in her quest for clues, which means we get immersed in these beautiful tableaus of mansions and nightclubs and parks and stores, alleyways, nightclubs, and more as we help her search. Y'all know I've been hooked on this game for a while now. It's such a great option for relaxing after a busy day of work without just totally letting your brain turn to mush, you know? It's so fun to uncover the next chapter of June's story, but that's not all there is to do here. If I'm feeling up to the challenge, I can take on some timed mini-games or join a club for some community competitions. And sometimes they give us deep dives on other characters' origin stories. My favorite is June's old aviator pal, Jack. You also get a whole island of your own to decorate with beautiful buildings, trees, flowers, animals, and even seasonal specialties like this spooky home in autumn foliage. Of course, I had to get myself a train too. Look at that guy, he's so nice. If you're looking for something to do on your phone that's not doom scrolling social media, June's Journey is a great option. Download June's Journey for free by clicking the link in the description below. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC. Thank you so much to June's Journey for sponsoring this video, and now, let's address the elephant in the room. I kind of want to hide an elephant in every room, just so that there's an elephant in every room. Why don't I have a serger? A select few of y'all have some strong feelings, big emotions, emphatic words to say about me not having a serger, to which I say, take a deep breath. I'm okay. There seems to be a general consensus that I can't afford one, so I get a lot of advice on how to find one for cheap, how to thrift one, and I've had some lovely, kind, so generous people offer to gift me theirs, which is so sweet. But let me lay that to rest. Thanks to all of you watching this video, watching all of my videos, I can absolutely afford to buy a serger. Round of applause, pat yourself on the back. All of you rock. Every single one of you. I appreciate you so much. But yeah, that's not the obstacle. So if you have one to give away, I highly recommend looking for someone in the area who might need it, or even giving it to like a library or a community center where classes are offered. It's hard to say exactly why I still don't have a serger. I think there are a couple reasons. One of them being that I'm very lazy and I hate learning new technology and machines, or just like adopting new stuff into my habits and practice. Basically, if what I'm doing is working, I'm not the type of person to really seek out ways to improve it. It's the reason all of my other tech stuff only gets updated when it either breaks or get so old that Matt is like, I am replacing this for you, or I'm updating it for you. God, I never update my phone or my computer or anything. I hate updating things. Anyway, I've used Sergers. I know how to use Sergers. I know I won't regret it if I do get a Serger, and it will make a lot of things a lot easier. But someone wrote as a reply to one of these, why don't you have a Serger questions, I think she's trying to remain relatable. And yeah, like, that's another one of the reasons. That's possibly the main reason. If I zip through all of my knit projects on a Serger in all of my videos, then the implication to a lot of people, especially new sewists, is going to be that that tool is necessary for this project, that they can't sew with knit fabric if they don't have the space or the budget to get a serger right now. And I very much want to promote the idea that sewing is approachable, that it is possible with limited tools, that you can create garments of all kinds even if you don't have a serger. It's not a necessary tool. If I sew my knit garments on a regular machine, then those who do have a serger at home will likely know how to adjust for the tool that they have. And those who don't have a serger at home may find themselves thinking, hey, maybe I can do that too. Maybe I can sew on stretch material. And I love that. So if you have big feelings about me not having a serger, just know that I don't. I'm okay. And I'm gonna share all of the tips and tricks that I have picked up for sewing knit garments without a serger, because it's not that hard most of the time. I've pulled all of the questions that y'all left on my easy knit clothes for summer video, so I will go through and answer all of those, and then also just throw in any other information I can think of that is not already covered. And as you saw, I pulled a whole bunch of knit from my closet, because there is not just one type of knit fabric, and I think that's the thing that people most overlook when they are intimidated by sewing on knit, or they're just thinking about all of the negative stereotypes. Not all knit is created equal, and that is to your benefit. Oh, here's a good one to start with. Do you have a guide you go by to know if a knit will work for what? They're basically asking about, if I have a garment design in my head, how do I know if that garment design will work for a knit fabric, or when I should use a knit for what garment design, all that stuff. And here's where, again, we should talk about how many different kinds of knit there are. It's honestly funny to me that it all gets thrown into one category. Like, I think the same thing happens with woven fabric. You think of like, actually, you know what? I don't think the same thing happens with woven fabric. I think generally people separate woven fabric out a lot more. You think of like a thin quilting cotton, or like a heavier brocade, like the different weights and textures of woven fabric tend to be more separated. And then when it comes to knit, people often just go knit, it's knit fabric, it's stretch material. These are so drastically different from each other. And some of these are a pain in the butt to work on, and I would not recommend it if you've never sewn on knit before. And other ones will feel just like sewing on a woven fabric. So I recently did the sort of fiber exploration of knit, and that was interesting and all, but that's not really the thing to think about necessarily unless you care about fiber specifically. But if you're thinking about the actual process of sewing on knit, it's less about the fiber that it's made out of and more about the weight and the texture and whether it is a one-way or a two-way stretch. And here's where I'm probably saying something wrong, because I always think of it as being one-way or two-way stretch, but I think it might actually be referred to as two-way or four-way stretch. So some knit materials stretch this way and this way. I think of that as a two-way stretch. And then other knit materials, I feel like I've got one here, only stretch in one direction. So this fabric, it's a light stretch to start with, but it is stretching in this direction. This direction, there's no stretch. So that already makes a really big difference when it comes to sewing it and how hard it's going to be and how it's going to feel in the machine. But it also makes a huge difference when it comes to patterning something out. So the variety of knit is something to take into consideration when you're thinking what can be made with knit fabric. Knits are quite often heavier materials. If I took the same yardage of a knit fabric and a woven fabric, it is likely the knit one would feel heavier in my hand. Also be heavier on a scale. That's how that works. But that is not necessarily true of all knit fabrics. Here are a couple really thin, slippery fabrics that I don't think you'd even assume are a knit when you look at that. I'm calling everything knit today because that's what we tend to do in America. I should throw that in here. We tend to refer to all stretch fabric as knit material, knit fabric in America. I know that's not the same in every country, but that's what I'm used to, so that's what we're going with. Anyway, this is a very light, breezy fabric that at first glance, you may think, like, that's a rayon. That's not a stretch material. Surprise, it actually is a stretch material. The stretch is light, like it's just kind of going boing, 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 but it's a stretch material. And it's very light and breezy and delightful. So that is a stretch material, and also this is a stretch material. This stuff that almost looks like a sweater. It's thick, it's textured, it's very heavy, and it's going to be very warm. All of these are stretch materials. So what can you make out of a stretch material? Anything? It's more about knowing which type of knit to put with which garment. I think this is the most common thing that people are thinking of when you say knit fabric or stretch material. It's fairly thin, like I can see the light through it. It's soft, and it's pretty dang stretchy. It's the stuff that tends to curl on the edges when you cut it out. It has a lot of weight to it. Yeah, I think this is often what's in people's head. I have a bunch of this. It's often in plain colors. It is a little trickier to sew on. Just think about how it's going to affect the garment. This is weightier, so if I made a circle skirt out of it, the circle skirt would not flow and have this breeziness to it. It would hang down. That doesn't mean that you can't make a circle skirt out of knit. You absolutely can still make a circle skirt out of knit. If you're making something that goes all the way to the floor, whether it's a dress or it's overalls, jumpsuit, something like that, think about the amount of fabric that's being used on the garment and the amount of fabric that is pulling down on itself. A shorter dress, you could use a heavier knit, and it's not gonna drag itself down as much because there's not as much of it there. A longer dress, you might wanna use something a little lighter or something more stable. That's the thing, it doesn't always have to be a lighter knit, it could just be a more stable knit. I feel like I could spend the whole video talking about this. My overall answer here is any garment can be made out of knit. It's more about what type of knit you're using. So go touch knits, pull on them, see how much the stretch is. The more fabric that's going into a garment means you want that knit to either be lighter or more stable. You need it to be able to support itself. A smaller garment, a pair of shorts, a t-shirt, even just a small sundress, use anything you want. Those aren't really gonna have any trouble. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm gonna question every single answer I give in this entire video. I'm gonna be like, are you sure? That seems like really dumb advice now that you've said it out loud. This is the way it goes. If you're starting with knit fabric, sorry, I felt the need to take a drink in the middle of that sentence. Maybe start with a more stable knit. I wouldn't even say necessarily to start with a lighter one. I made something out of this and I recall it giving me slight issues, just slight ones, not much. But something like this, a thicker knit, it's still pretty stretchy in one direction. Like, that's some pretty big stretch. But boink, 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 it's not stretchy in the other direction. That is gonna be pretty dang easy to sew on. Maybe avoid making something that is... See, I don't like saying that actually. I don't like saying avoid doing this because it might be hard the first time. Make the garment that you most want. If that's a pair of knit shorts, if it's a camisole, if it's a bodycon dress, make the thing that you most want. You might as well give it a try. Okay, and then there were a couple questions about laying your fabric out. How do you get it flat? How do you cut it out? How do you keep the edges from rolling? How do you deal with all of that? Again, this is gonna drastically depend on what kind of knit you're using. Some are going to be completely unproblematic, and some are going to be the biggest pain in the butt you've ever experienced. A general thing I will say about knit fabric is that if you have static electricity coursing through your home because it's winter or it's dry or whatever it is, that's not helpful. I have to wonder how many people have tried to make something out of stretch material for the first time in the winter and became so frustrated by it, because if your fabric is staticky at all and it's wanting to stick together, oh yeah, massive pain in the butt. So start with that. Test if your fabric is staticky. If it's actually sticking together, or if it's doing that crackle thing when you pull it apart, get some static cling. I think people say you can rub it down with a dryer sheet. I'm gonna let you look up tips for that on your own, how to get rid of static electricity. But don't try to lay out fabric if it's staticky. Here's a great example. This stuff is not great to sew on. It'll be hard over there, but it lays out so easily because it's weighty and slippery and smooth. The inside of this fabric, completely smooth, no texture, so it doesn't want to stick to itself at all. It very easily will lay flat. It very easily will fold wherever I want it to fold. Oh, great, easy. This to me is a lot easier than some woven fabrics. There are woven fabrics that are shifty and slippery and sliding everywhere. This is like, ta-da, ta-da, ha, delightful. One thing to keep in mind is the weight of your knit. Do you have a long stretch of fabric that's hanging off the end of whatever you're using to cut stuff out on? That's pulling down on your fabric. So wad it all up on the end of your table. I put a chair down there sometimes and let all the extra material balance on the chair, whatever you need to do. But like, gravity is a huge thing you have to keep in mind when you are using knit fabric. The effect of gravity upon knit is much, much different than the effect of gravity upon woven. So that was an easy one. Let's try something else. This guy, this is like a kind of thing that's gonna want to stick to itself if I have static. I don't have static right now, which is great. We haven't hit winter yet. But even without that, no, never mind. It's not sticking to itself at all. Again, this is one thing that like a lot of people say laying out knits is super hard, and I think I've only had trouble on a very select few if static electricity is not involved. So it's a good thing to take your fabric from the actual fold wherever you've made it, just lift it from there and give it like a little shake and a whoosh. Just like make sure that as you lay fabric down, it's not being stretched out for any reason on the actual table. Look how easily this guy, he just kind of floats to where you want it. Cool. Give it a fold. You've got lots of wrinkles underneath, so again, that's where I pick up at the fold, give it a shake, get those wrinkles out, lay it out again. Some of it does take time, so see, like this would be something that I think some people would think of as more difficult. Pick up the top layer, give it a slight shake, lay it down, pick up the side, shake it again, lay it down. There we go. That was a couple pickups and shakes, and we are flat now. It's wrinkly because it's just wrinkly, but there's no actual wrinkles in the under fabric. There are definitely materials that you're just gonna have to do that more. It's a lot of pick it up and shake it, pick it up and shake it, put it back down. Again, if you don't have static electricity, I'm really like, is it all the fault of static electricity? If your fabric is sticking to itself when you do this, if it's not just easily picking up, you got problems and it's gonna be hard, and like that's not the fabric's fault. That's the weather's fault. Another thing that I think maybe causes problems for people in the laying out, if you're used to working on woven, is being a little too obsessed with grain lines. And here's where, again, I feel like some people are gonna be like, no, grain lines matter. I don't care as much about grain lines on knit. And by I don't care as much, I mean I often don't care at all. That's not to say that you cut things out willy-nilly wherever, but especially on fabrics that stretch in both directions, If you're like ever so slightly crooked, I don't think it's gonna make that big of a difference. So if you're laying out your fabric and you're like obsessively over here, like, am I straight? Is this on the grain? Is it not going how it's supposed to go? It doesn't have to be perfect. Your garment will still be okay, which is like my go-to advice for knit in general. It doesn't have to be perfect. Your garment will still be okay. That's why I love knit fabric. Grain line is gonna matter a little bit more on a knit that only stretches in one direction. But even then, I'm not talking about like, you're slightly like this, oh no, everything is ruined. It'll be fine. I'm just saying as far as if you cut it out this way or this way matters a lot more. So on that note, we'll kind of move on to the question of patterning. A lot of people asked about how do you know how to account for stretch when you're doing measurements? How do you figure that out? I will say right now, this is not an area I'm very good in yet. And why is because, again, knit fabric is all drastically different. You can't just have one overall rule. A fabric that stretches one way but not the other cannot really be directly compared to a fabric that stretches both ways. A fabric that stretches a little bit like this can't really be compared to one that stretches a lot a bit. If you're going to be patterning something from scratch, it helps to measure your stretch first. If you've ever looked at a pattern that's meant to be made out of knit, there's a little thing on the back that says like, your knit fabric should stretch this much. It'll have like a bar and then a second bar, and it's like, you hold up your stretch fabric this much, and you need to be able to stretch it to here, or else this pattern is going to give you trouble. If you're making your own garment without a pattern, you need to kind of do that same thing. So this fabric does not stretch this direction. It does stretch this direction, which means I would want to put the parts that are going around my body horizontally in this direction. But if your fabric stretches in both directions, you could cut stuff out in either way. I've done it before. It works, it's fine. So then the thing to consider on a two-way stretch is how much stretch it has. I will just lay out a ruler or a measuring tape and then take the end of my fabric, put it on 1, put my fingers on 6, so I have 6 inches of fabric, and then holding down the side that's on 1, stretch it as far as I can. This fabric goes to 10, as opposed to this one, 6 inches goes to 9.5. So it only stretches in one direction, but the amount of stretch it stretches in that direction is actually really similar to this one. What about this super light stuff? 6 inches. Oh, 6 inches of this fabric only stretches to 7 inches. So that is a drastically different stretch amount. If you cut out the exact same pattern, the exact same measurements out of both of these fabrics, you would have a drastically different fit in the end. Either one would be too big or one would be too small. So a fabric like this that only has that 1 extra inch of stretch, I would not generally account for ease at all. I would pattern this out the same way I was patterning out a woven fabric pattern garment. And then I would try it on in the end, and if I wanted it to be a little more stretched or snatched, I'd maybe adjust some seams, because in the end, that adjustment is gonna be like 1/4 of an inch maybe. But you'll find on a lot of these thinner knits that they stretch to like almost double. Granted, you don't want to be stretching it like that on your body. You probably want like that on your body. Just a slight amount of stretch. So right now, again, because I don't actually know this super well, I tend to just guess and make everything a little bit bigger than I think it needs to be, so I can then just cut it down in the end. You can always resew seams a little closer and trim off the excess. But for something like that, that stretches from 6 to 10, I would probably remove a couple inches from things that I want to be stretched. If you have something that's going to be fitted around the middle, you want to accommodate that stretch. So you don't actually want, let's say I'm 32 around at the waist. If I wanted something to actually be fitted to my waist, and it's as stretchy as this, it wouldn't actually be 32 inches. It would probably only need to be like 28. It could probably be like 22 and still stretch around me, but do I want it to be stretched out or do I want it to sit comfortably? This is the thing, there's so much leeway. Do you want your garment to have to stretch or do you want it to just sit at its relaxed place and be able to stretch if you change sizes? Really think about, in the normal state of wearing this garment, is there going to be stretch automatically applied to this area of the garment? If the stretch is not inherently tied into how the garment is going to fall, don't worry about it so much. Experiment, try things. That is the joy of knit fabric. Because it stretches so much, because there's so much adjustability, you don't have to worry about it that much. It'll probably be fine. That's already been a lot of talking. Just out here. Someone did ask about cutting out fabric. They said they tend to struggle with the actual cutting out process. That's not something I've had a lot of trouble with. If it's something super slippery like this, in the same way that a super slippery woven fabric can be problematic, yeah, it's gonna wanna shift around. I recommend using pattern weights all around and making sure that it stays where it's gonna be. I don't actually have pattern weights. I use paraphernalia. Again, when it comes to cutting out, make sure that there's not fabric that's drifting off the table. It might not have anything pulling on it when it's laying flat before you start cutting, but once you've cut half the garment out, is this piece of fabric shifting downward and pulling on this piece of fabric here? Make sure as you're cutting things out, the gravitational pull on your fabric is not changing. I think we can move to the actual sewing room. Oh, the curling edges thing. That just happens with some knits. It is annoying, but it does not happen with all knits. So again, that's like maybe if one is curling a lot and it's annoying you, start with a more stable knit. Start with something that just won't curl because not all of them do. As we discovered with literally this fabric right here, this is bamboo knit, but I think this applies to a lot of other kind of knits. You can iron it. So if you cut out your pieces and then all of your pattern pieces are curling on all the sides, right before you're gonna sew with them, iron them. Always test first and make sure you can iron it, because if it is like a light polyester or something, it could melt a little. Don't like go in there and iron all your pieces and then set them aside and come back 2 days later to sew them. Iron the pieces that you're about to sew. But that should, assuming it's a fabric that's not gonna melt, get your curled edges laying flat long enough for you to sew over them. And then they might curl up again later, but you're good because you already sewed on them. Hello, sweet boy. Oh, Mr. Squish. Mr. Squishy Squish. I love you so much, yes I do. Bye. Okay, so first thing to take note of here, and this was the one piece of advice that I actually got and followed prior to starting to sew with knit fabric. Someone asked, I recall reading something about using either a larger needle or maybe a specialized sharp needle, perhaps with a ball in the end, to make it easier. Yeah, so, we're fine. The one piece of advice I got from my expert seamstress sister before I started was about the needle type to use. By the way, my sister Carrie, who is actually does know what she's doing when it comes to sewing, has a video with advice about knit as well, which I will link in the description. It probably has better advice than mine, so go check out hers. The thing that she told me though was to use an actual needle for stretch material. We typically use universal needles if you've just started sewing, or if you only sew on woven, that's probably what you have. There are needles for knit fabric, and they might be called different things. For example, I have some that are called ballpoint. So what was explained to me is that the ballpoint helps spread out the fibers to create a hole for the needle to go through, rather than just stabbing through a fiber as a sharp needle will do on woven fabric. Whether it's called ballpoint, stretch, this one has jersey needles and stretch in the same container. What's the difference? I don't know. I don't have the full explanation as to why you should use these, but you should. What's up, my love? Twin needles are great for sewing on knit, except if you don't fully know how to use them. I have used a twin needle once or twice. I'm not very good at it yet. My advice right now is that if you want to learn how to use a twin needle, go for it. It can give you some great professional looking results. It can give you some stretchier seams because the stitch on the back is interlocking and therefore has some like ease to it. There are lots of other videos on YouTube about how to use a twin needle. I am not your go-to source for that. Okay, sorry, I randomly paused for lunch. Not that that matters to you. Where were we? Probably the most common question that I got, not probably, the most common question I got was about machine settings and stitch types. For starters, come closer. I do pretty much always use a knit presser foot now, simply because I have it. After doing presser foot explorations, it looks like this. I'm not the person to ask how this fully works, but basically every time your needle goes up and down, it's lifting your foot up and down. So it's kind of the same as a walking foot, but without being like as thorough. I don't know, a walking foot is definitely doing it even more so. So a walking foot is also something you could use if you've been struggling with knit. Basically, the lifting up and down of the foot just means that your fabric's gonna pass underneath a little smoother without getting stretched out as much. I don't like using the walking foot because I have to like completely unscrew this thing to put it on and I'm too lazy. So the knit foot works great for me. You can literally like, I don't normally promote shopping on Amazon, but like go on Amazon and look up knit presser foot. Wasn't that expensive. However, I also did sew with knit for quite a while before I even got this presser foot. So again, this is helpful, but not necessary. Thread type. I typically just use regular thread. Thread the thread. Just like your normal stuff. I will say there are some threads that I have because I tend to buy stuff at remainders. I'll just get a handful of them that you can feel from the thread itself is thicker. You don't really want to use anything like that on stretch materials. If you're using random, vintage, thrifted thread types, just like give it a feel, make sure that it's like average, very average. But as far as using the thread types that are like for stretch materials, again, I just tried this for the very first time in my overalls video. So I'm not gonna repeat all the information. If you wanna see that exploration, go check out that video. But basically I tried Metler Seriflex thread and then Coates & Clark Eloflex. The Eloflex was noticeably stretchy thread, and I did not really like the results. I think it would be helpful in specific circumstances, but it was not necessarily great to sew an entire project with. The Seriflex thread, I really did like. It just had a slight give to it, and I thought it was great to sew with. That being said, I've never seen that in the store before, like in a good old Joann's, so I have to double check if you can even find it easily. Like, I had to dig it up on Amazon. I'd love to use that thread more, but if it's more expensive, harder to find, and doesn't come in as many colors, the reality is that I'm not. Regular thread is fine. As for machine settings, if we're gonna talk tension, I don't know that it's necessarily helpful for me to tell you what my tension is set on, because tension is very specific to a machine. My recommendation here would be to test, especially if you're sewing something on stretch material for the first time, or you're using a very different kind of stretch material than you've ever used before. Just test. I'll do this all the time. Before I start the actual sewing, I'll take a scrap of whatever fabric it is, make sure it's big enough that you can put two on top of each other, or just get two. Test it. Test your tension, your stitch length, the needle type that you're using, the needle size that you're using, the type of thread that you're using, and just make sure that it's doing basically what it should. I keep my tension on a 2 pretty much all the time, unless I'm basting, in which case I'll knock it down to 0. When my sister was last here, she was looking at some of my stitches on a woven garment, and she was like, oh, your tension is too low, which is likely true. On woven material, I should probably be putting my tension at 3 or 4, but I put it up there and then left it there and started sewing a knit garment, and it gave me problems. So 2 is probably a fairly low tension as machines typically go. It's the tension that has worked for me to just go through a bunch of different types of material and not have to change it. Stitch type. I only use two: straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. Someone asked about a stretch setting. They said they have a stretch setting on their machine. I don't. So I don't know anything about that. I'm sorry, I don't know what that entails. I have also heard it said, or seen it said in comments, that you should always be using a zigzag stitch on stretch materials. I don't agree with that, but you definitely could just always use a zigzag stitch. Absolutely. I don't really know why I don't like to use a zigzag stitch on everything, but I very specifically don't. I think the way that the seam folds open just feels a little bit different to me because of the width of that stitch. I don't really know, but I don't like to use a zigzag on everything, and you can absolutely use a straight stitch. Take this shirt, for example. All of these seams, the shoulder seam here, the side seam, it's just a straight stitch. In the course of putting on and wearing this garment, there's no tension consistently being put on these seams. Yes, it might stretch while I'm putting it on, but like the fabric itself will still stretch around the seam. The seam does not need to stretch. So I could have sewn those with a zigzag and that would have been fine, but I could also sew it with a straight stitch and that's also fine. On the other hand, things like this cuff on the sleeve that's going around my arm and therefore has the tension of my arm pushing against it all the time, that I sewed with a zigzag, which means it stretches a little, it gives a little. I can pull on it like that and it's not gonna snap. So typically any kind of cuff, a lot of times on binding, I'll use zigzag. Honestly, sometimes I don't use zigzag on binding for some reason and then I regret it. It's better to do it. And then a lot of times I'll use a zigzag stitch on a hem, which we will talk about in a minute because a lot of people asked about hemming. As far as like the stitch length, when I'm in straight stitch, I'm pretty much always on a stitch length of 2 on my machine. When I switch it to a zigzag, I'll usually take my width up to 4 or 5, and then I might take my length to 3. Keep in mind that the more ziggity-zaggity your zigzag is, the more it's gonna let you stretch. If you did a high stitch length and a low stitch width, you'd have like a barely zigzag stitch, and that's gonna give you barely any give. On the other hand, if you do a really short stitch length, so everything is crammed together, with a really long stitch width, you'd basically have satin stitch, which might have some give to it. That would actually be interesting to try, but probably not much again because it's so tight packed together. So you kind of want to find a middle ground. Usually for me, that's 4 or 5 in width and 2 or 3 in length. Once you've tested things on a couple projects, a couple different types of knit, you won't have to keep testing stuff on every project after that unless you start using something totally different. I don't do a test before every single project anymore because I've used a lot of different types of knit now. But it's a good idea to do those tests the first several times. Like, here's the reality of straight stitch on knit. Do you pop seams sometimes? Yes. I will move around weird on the couch and hear something go snap. I'll find little holes like this big in a seam every now and then. But also, I have a sewing machine right here. I made the garment. I literally just have to bring it in here and go zip. I don't even always put the right thread in. You just sew the hole closed again. I mean, obviously you can pop seams whether they are straight or zigzag stitches because these are not stretchy seams. You might have a little more give with the zigzag stitch. It's gonna be a little more forgiving, but you can still pop it. If you step on the hem of your dress as you're standing up, not that I've ever done that before, you're probably gonna pop a seam. Okay, hemming. I don't really do anything fancy with hemming. I do the same thing that I do on anything else, whether woven or not. It's just a double fold and you sew it down. Usually I do it in one go, so you're double folding as you sew rather than folding once, sewing the whole thing and folding again. I'm not super picky about my hems, and here's the thing, most of my hems are curved. That's quite frequent for me, and on the inside, they get little tucks in them. I don't mind if the fabric has a little tuck or a wrinkle on the inside of the hem, because it's the inside of the hem. The outside still looks fine. And no one should be looking at the inside of my hems, so I don't really care if they don't look perfect. I mean, honestly, hemming a knit circle skirt can kind of be easier at times because you have the stretch. It's almost like hemming something that's on the bias, like you can manipulate it and you can get it to lay flat. Oh, neck binding. I don't think I should give advice on neck binding. I pretty much never get it correct, like ever. There are some really great videos, just like straight up tutorial videos on YouTube though, for how to bind a V-neck, a crew neck, a square neck, any kind of stuff. Just specifically look up how to bind a knit top or a knit t-shirt, stuff like that. Seam finishes or edge finishes. I do not finish the edges of my knit. There's no French seaming. I don't think I've ever tried to do French seams on a stretch material. It doesn't sound like it would be fun. But as you'll observe here, my edges are just raw. I wear this dress so much. It has been washed many, many, many times. And this is what the edges look like at this time. Like, that ain't bad. So up here, this is like the bust of the dress. So it is like touching my skin or my bra or whatever. It's like having contact, and you can see that it's a little more frayed on the edges. However, this has also been top stitched down, and that is really just the style of this pattern. And that is, you know, just giving it a little more protection for these areas that are gonna rub down a little bit faster. But even that, like, that's barely anything for how often this dress has been worn and washed over and over again. Same on this dress. This is a drastically different kind of knit. I haven't worn or washed this one quite as much, but still pretty frequently. And again, the edges just don't really look worn down. So yeah, this is one of those things that, like, if I had a serger, sure, I would whip all those through the serger and finish the edge, and maybe they would last a little bit longer. But without having a serger and without doing anything to the seams, not the seams, I always say the seam finish, but it's actually just your edge of fabric finish. Without doing anything to the edge of fabric, it's still holding up just fine through frequent use. Okay, I feel like that was all the kind of specific questions, and the last ones are just sort of generally for sewing on knit. How do you keep it from stretching? How do you keep it from puckering, etc. actually in the machine? Again, a proper needle is going to be helpful. A knit presser foot will be helpful, but is not necessary. If your tension is right and your thread is not ridiculously thick and weird, that's gonna be helpful. So a lot of the stuff we already talked about. Number one thing to remember while you are actually sewing the piece through is gravity. It's still gravity. These are all small pieces, so it won't affect it that much. But if you're sewing a big piece of your garment, or towards the end when you're sewing on your entire garment, you've got the whole thing here. Like, for example, by the time I'd be like adding the binding onto this garment, it's all attached. I've got the whole thing here, and part of it is under the machine. That's a lot of weight. You do not want that weight to be pulling on whatever is under the machine at all in any way, shape, or form. And since you're moving, you have to keep constant track of that, because you might have everything bunched up here. It's great. There's no tension. There's no pulling. But as you go all the way through the machine, like when you're doing the hem, all of a sudden a bunch of it is here, and then it falls off, and then it's pulling everything back like this. That's going to cause a problem. Sometimes I'll start with stuff in my lap, and it'll be fine for a little bit, and then I'll realize that I'm not releasing enough of it forward, and it's being pulled in this direction towards me. If gravity is not pulling on your piece of fabric, then theoretically, nothing should be pulling on your piece of fabric. It's just the effect of your foot and the plate meeting each other, and the thread. I'm losing track of what advice I have left. I think thinking about gravity is honestly the biggest piece of advice that I can give. In like all areas of sewing with knit, just really think about gravity. And then when it comes to sewing two pieces of fabric together, let's be real, that's what most of these seams are. We're not just sewing on one piece of fabric. People asked, how do you keep one from stretching out more than the other? I don't. So I will often, when sewing a seam on a knit garment, start from the side where I really want things to line up. So like if I'm sewing this seam here, I will try to always start from up here where I want the neckline to be even and clean all the way down. If it's slightly off by the time it reaches the cuff, I can trim that straight and it's not affecting the garment as a whole. Honestly, there's probably more advice that I can give and definitely a whole lot of advice that other sewists who are more experienced than I am and have tried a lot more things can give. So check the comments for further advice, check past videos. As I learn things, I share it with you guys. So if I have the information, if I just gained a bit of knowledge, it's probably in a video somewhere, it's just mixed in with everything else. And YouTube is full of tutorials for specific things. So if you're wondering, how do I hem a circle skirt made of knit material? Somebody has probably made a video with like 3 different methods for you. Don't be afraid to, well, I don't know why you'd be afraid. Don't forget that you can search really specific things and it very likely is out there. And then just my overall advice for knit is like, don't be afraid of it. Experiment, test, play around, look at what different kinds of stretch material are out there because they are vastly, vastly different, and you're going to have very different sewing experiences based on the type of knit that you're using. Get yourself a couple different kinds, try stuff out, see how it goes. Knit is more forgiving than you think. And don't forget to check out June's Journey. You can download June's Journey for free by clicking the link in the description below. It is available on Android and iOS mobile devices as well as PC. And thank you to June's Journey again for sponsoring this video. I'd like to not give advice again for a while. I want to learn new things and be bad at them, so I'm gonna do that. Someone's gotta be hard. Come here, be difficult for me. You should take a bigger breath or calm down. One or the other would be fine. Let's go to the sewing room. So then the thing to consider on a double stretch, 2-way stretch, 1-way stretch, no, 4-way stretch. Someone's doing yard work. Neck binding. Oh, I zoomed in here. I'm afraid my mic is dead.